Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I can already tell that we're going to have a very lively discussion at the end of the next set of papers because everyone is just so enthusiastically moving around and buzzing with energy and excitement and conversation. So I hope that we can carry that forward and roll ourselves right into our final panel of the day. And with that, I am so enthusiastic to bring to the podium Sampada Aranke, who is assistant professor in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute across the street. Her research interests include performance theories of embodiment, visual culture, and Black cultural and aesthetic theory. Her work has been published in several journals as well as museum catalogs, including for Art Forum and Art Journal. And she's also worked on some recent curatorial projects, including a project called Unstable Objects for the Alice Gallery in 2017, and a project called Collapse, Recent Works by Dewey Crumpler at Hedreen Gallery in 2018. She's currently working on a book manuscript, and I know we're all super excited to see this come out, The Visual Culture, Death's Futurity, The Visual Culture of Death in Black Radical Politics. So please come to the podium and please help me welcome Sampada.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jill, and welcome to the last session. I think we're all really excited. I know I am. Please excuse my coughs and sniffles. The universe has punished me with a summer cold, so I'm trying to get through it. But it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Rebecca Schneider. Rebecca Schneider is professor of theater arts and performance studies at Brown University. She is the author of The Explicit Body in Performance, 1997, Performing Remains, Art and War in Times of Theatrical Reenactment from 2011, Theater and History from 2014, and forthcoming Remains with Jesse Perica in 2018. In addition, she is the editor or author of many essays, anthologies, and journal special issues on topics relating to performance, visual art, media, and theater. Please welcome Rebecca to the stage.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm so honored and so intimidated because of the incredible wealth of knowledge and practice in terms of visual art and performance. I'm a performance theorist, so I really appreciate the title Unfixed. I feel like my talk is going to be somewhat unfixed relative to the other subtitles of contemporary and material. So we'll see what happens. Thank you to Sampada. Thank you to Jill. It's been a really amazing day. And if you look at my paper, it's not even a paper anymore. It's like a map of all the comments that I wanted to make based on all the really inspiring things that have already been said. So we'll see what happens. Yes, my work has been largely kind of based on trying to think about what is body-to-body transmission. And my earlier work really resisted the idea of performance-based work as not remaining, of performance-based work as not enduring. And I wanted to think about the ways in which the live body-to-body transmission was a mode of remaining and a mode of enduring. And indeed, as I've kind of gone on thinking about this since the Performing Remains book, I've come to try to actually think. I think one of the things I'm thinking is that liveness, or the category of liveness, or flesh even, extends and is in some ways even less vulnerable than works of, let's say, more obdurate materials that we assume are obdurate, like stone, right? For instance, stone. And that you'll see why I've kind of come to think that in the talk that I've planned for us today. Certainly, I think we can think of liveness as something that's old, if not even older, than most of the work that we think of as object-based. And even work that's moving in geologic time, right, is, there's ways of perhaps thinking of liveness as also moving in geologic time. So one of the things we have to think about in thinking about time-based art is what is time? And that's already been thought about or suggested a number of times today. With Miwan said it this morning. Whose time? For whom is time a certain mode of time? It kind of seems weird to ask when is time, but what mode of time are we talking about when we talk about time-based art? When we open out sort of our concepts of time to nonlinear time, for instance, or other cultural renditions of time, then what I would suggest is the white liberal subjects' progress-oriented or forward-marching time. Then what happens? What kind of pressures are put on the institutions of art or put on kind of efforts at preservation, put on ideas of display, put on ideas of access, and put on ideas of documentation. I'm also very interested in the idea that if artworks exist always as entangled or in relation, right, then, in other words, if there is no such thing as a singular work of art or a discrete object, as was said earlier, if artworks, that is, always exist in relation to other artworks and are, in that sense, entangled in a rather reverberatory surround with other works in other times even, then is any discrete, quote-unquote discrete work of art ever discrete? I mean, isn't it always already off of itself and into its interrelations? And if a work of art is off of itself and into its interrelations, how do we preserve? Do we have to preserve those things? Is it the intervals between artworks, in a sense, that also should be thought about relative to, quote, preservation or conservation? Which is, I'm sure that you all are all thinking about that, but these are things I'm beginning to think about. And I was inspired to think about this first with Fred Moten, but then with others. The idea of one medium taking place in another medium, so that one thinks of a ricochet of one artwork coming back to one through another artwork. Or the idea of a sort of syncopated set of media, if one thinks about something like phonic materiality, which is Fred's phrase. Or one thinks about the sound of a photograph, for instance. One is thinking of one sort of disciplinary orientation, one media orientation off of itself and into another. And that being off of itself is what I'm going to talk about in terms of gesture in a minute. Because what I'm interested in is the interval, the intervals between artworks, so to speak. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that gesture is something that always produces an interval. So I'm interested in thinking with artworks that gesture in terms of thinking about in terms of seeing what we can think if we think with gesture. So one of the things that I'm working on is, in a sense, the idea of the jump of objects into relation. So another thing that comes up when I'm thinking about this is, what is the work if it's always in relation, if there is no such thing as an individual? And I think here we have to think of the individual as an assumption of humanism anyway, as a construct of the subject-object divide. The subject-object divide that some scholars like Elizabeth Povinelli give to what she calls late settler liberalism. She also calls it late liberal settlerism or something. You can combine those words in any way that you want to, but also someone like the indigenous scholar Glenn Coulthard really talks about just extractive colonial capitalism and puts the hyphen always, whenever talking about capitalism, talks about colonialism simultaneously, whenever talking about colonialism, talks about capitalism simultaneously, and that capital colonialism produces a model of time, produces not only a model of time, but something else that I just thought of that went away. So produces a model of time, a mode of time, really. So that when we're talking about time-based work, what mode of time are we dragging with us in that time-based work? Are we dragging with us always settler colonial time? Or do we want to think about other modes of time in relationship to those works? So Paul Vanelli, for instance, talks about the contemporary as the Anthropocene, and the contemporary really as, in a sense, it's sort of the human, the results of human destructions based on capitalism and colonial capitalism, extractive machine. So. And other people like Francois Verger call it the Capitalocene. Francois Verger calls it the racial Capitalocene, to always remember the engagements of flesh, of the flesh trade in the capital colonial registration. And what Povinelli says is that then, well, she says, I take from the indigenous artists and folks that I work with, not the idea that it's human only or human made only, but it's a mode of human that has gotten us to the situation that we face in terms of the precarities not only for humans, the differentially distributed precarities also for the geologic time of the planet. So precarities that were once thought of in terms of lifespans of humans are now actually geologically registered, like time in an expansive register of a precarity outside the register of the human and into the register of geology. So geologic time. So she says, I follow the indigenous folks that I'm working with, who say this isn't just human made, but it's a mode of human engagement. And that mode of human engagement is a white settler colonial inheritance. So it's not okay to say all humans have made this. Not all humans have been white settler colonials, but to sort of name it as in a particular historical register, right? And so this is one of the challenges of this, is to sort of to think about the mode of time and mode of human as both specifically historical and then also in vast range. So one of the things that I've been interested in doing is thinking about, is not, all right, I'm going to go through to the slides here and see if I can orient myself a little bit more with the images I put together. So the inter-inanimate is something I've been thinking about in terms of resisting the binary between liveness on the one side and non-liveness on the other, but to think always of the ways that we are, the live and the non-live are composed in and of each other, engaged always in intra-action. Inter-inanimate means both animate and inanimate together. And in this, I'm also riffing on Karen Barad's intra-action that was just mentioned earlier. Or one can think of somebody like Mel Chen and the suggestion of the live and the non-live, the human and the non-human, always also interacting in a kind of intimacy, what she calls a queer intimacy. And I'm interested in this to disallow or to reroute sedimented distinctions between our binaries, such as the inanimate and the animate, or between binaries such as the material and the immaterial. And I think that this kind of rerouting against these kinds of binarized distinctions does end up troubling temporality or troubling a particular mode of temporality. Performance is usually linked with time-based art and thought of in distinction to non-live object-based art. And duration is key in time-based work. Live art and time-based art supposedly have a beginning and an ending, in distinction to objects or artwork which are composed of a there-ness or a more indefinite endurance, such as works that remain apparently unchanged across hundreds or thousands of years. But here I agree with earlier statements about that all work is time-based. And I think obviously our categories have seemed to have become entirely fungible today. We absolutely can see the entanglement of liveness and the non-live with the Rodin and Segal, and the question of mimesis between stone body and live body. And mimesis, by the way, is not the same as representation. But the space between the stone body and the live body, or among the stone body and the live body, are something that is really interesting to me. And again, it's an interval. An interval, in a sense, you could say it's citational, but what do we do, and how do we curate, or how do we preserve the interval of intra-animation between, let's say, stone and live, for instance. I'm going to think about that as call and response in a minute, but I think to think about these things antiphonically is actually very interesting. So, recently, obviously, and here's another example for those of you that know the film Voyage to Italy from '59, a kind of film that really revels in the interrelationship between live and stone, where it's undecidable that the seemingly live body of Ingrid Bergman, who's caught in a, quote, dead marriage, is any more live than, the sculpture that she's brought through a museum in Naples to engage with. Rossellini completely sort of challenges our, and of course, we say, oh, Ingrid Bergman's live and the sculpture is not live, but obviously it's a film. None of them are live, and none of them are stone. Anyway, so that's just another example, but I want to go to another, I want to show you a clip that's rather astounding in the reach of liveness, and also a claim for duration in terms of, you might have to play this for me, and there's sound with it. Now wait, pause for a minute, because I want to give everybody the permission to laugh with this clip. It'll become clear about what it is in a minute, but feel free to laugh and go right ahead. There should be sound. Where's the sound? We checked it earlier. Okay. So this exhibition at the British Museum in 2013, Ice Age: Arrival of the Modern Mind, made the claim that Ice Age art is 40,000-year-old live art, which is actually a very interesting claim, but one that I think is very, very problematic for a number of reasons. And obviously it gives to the contemporary, it gives Ice Age art to the contemporary, following on certain paleontologists like David Lewis Williams, who are arguing with cognitive science that the modern mind is what makes, is at the basis, the sort of synapses that you see bursting in the background. Are what give a kind of universalizes art to the human synapse across time. This is extremely problematic for the fact that it kind of vacates all kinds of possible historical differences between modernity and prehistory, for instance. But it's actually very interesting, I think, to think about I think there were other models of thinking cross-temporally than this one, and I came upon this exhibition when I was researching for work on Paleolithic negative hands, the hand stencils, that I had set out to think about those hand stencils as gestures, as what I was thinking of as kind of ongoing, possibly ongoing gestures. I wasn't thinking of them as 40,000-year-old live art at the moment. On the other hand, I was trying to think about I was trying to think about what happens if we think with a piece of with an object as gesturing across time and engaged in an encounter of call and response. So I want to read a little bit from that work that I'm working on. All right. As we all know, everyone knows about the negative hands, up to 40,000-year-old artworks that continue to hold bare rock in, quote, human hands. Held up in and as stone, the hands are gesturing. They're gesturing, greeting, hailing, beckoning. They are arresting. The barefaced rock that takes on the shape of the hand is negative space surrounded by the paint. And so negative hand stencils are not paintings of hands so much as they are painting of the space around, among, or between parts of hands that appear thus as rock/hands. Some of the negative hands appear to have lifelines that are the veins of rock. Sorry, this is the one I wanted to show with the lines. And others have the literal curve of a palm. The rock may be anthropomorphized in this way, but the human is similarly turned to stone as the two are interinanimated. Because the paint is what fills in between the fingers, the rock is what shines through the palm in greeting. Where they appear in groups, as in Gargas Cave in France, for example, or at Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, the hands form a reverberant collective. They seem as well to be performing. That is, they do not seem to me to be only traces or records of bygone gestures, though they are that. They seem to be also ongoing gestures. This one's at Chauvet, which I haven't been to, but when I went to about 9 caves in 2013, you're not allowed to take pictures. And to me, this sensation is most striking when a hand appears alone. After visiting Fontaine, Rouffignac, and others, I finally found myself standing with a negative hand in ephemeral, a hand, my first, that our guide introduced as female. I would be lying if I said I wasn't moved. She would have stood where I stood then, even as her palm seems to face me inverted, as if from the inside the rock itself. This is an image, yes, but it is also a gesture ongoing, moving with the rock in geologic time that holds the hand against its face. The word negative is key because as I stand with a Paleolithic hand stencil, it is in fact the negative space that defines the experience. It is the not there of the human that appears where the hand takes shape. What appears in and as the hand is the there of the rock. This is important because I want to avoid universalizing the hand as a sign of humanity. For if the history of the concept of human is hierarchical, exclusionary, and founded on whiteness, and read the GLQ issue on queer and humanism on that note, then these hands, well outside the humanism of the racial Capitalocene, might gesture from outside the liberal limitations of that concept. I want to avoid following Heidegger and making the hand a stand-in for human thought, and thus the condition and sign of human exceptionalism. As opposed to an index of exceptionalism, I prefer to read the Paleolithic hand as performing a withness that beckons both to and with the rock, as well as to any being who might come upon that rock as hail. For me, with the negative hands, that which appears anthropomorphic appears only so by virtue of the non-human rock, and thus we might assume that the rock is neither cheapened, belittled, nor rendered binary other to the hand. And I'm following Cedric Robinson here on the problem of the cheapening of material in the racial Capitalocene. So rather, hand palpitating rock face and rock in and as hand are simply held together as gesture over time, mimetic and co-constitutive, rather than strictly or only representational. The rock is also that to which, as well as with which, the Paleolithic hand may be considered to gesture. A recent theory by paleoarchaeologists published in Antiquity, the journal Antiquity, posits that the hands may have been placed to bring forth or call out rock, and not, as we are more conditioned to assume, to as we are more conditioned to assume, not to emphasize the human in distinction to its material support. So how am I thinking of gesture in this larger project? I also went to Lascaux 2, which is probably very interesting for our conversation about preservation. There's now a Chauvet 2 as well, some of you may have been to. But of course, the idea of the problem of Lascaux 2 is that, right, the Paleolithic art is incrementally disappearing. So one has to preserve it by a copy, by making a copy of the cave that one then goes to in the interest of preserving the cave. But what is the thing that is rendering the Paleolithic art to be disappearing? It is liveness. And so, I mean, this is interesting to me in terms of the problem of the disappearing that liveness is in this way more enduring, is that which needs to be protected from liveness rather than the ephemerality and vulnerability, right, of liveness. We have quite the opposite here with stone. And this is I think, kind of a surprise, right? What are we thinking about when we think about the vulnerability of geologic time, the vulnerability of objects in geologic time, relative to the ongoingness of an out of control, an out of control live with all its CO2 and all of its plastic. Of course, this is made out of plastic, this copy. So I think another thing I wanted to say about the hands, that's I think the negative hands, but probably also all of the Paleolithic art, is, why talk about this now relative to the conversations that we've been having? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about the negative hands is that if I'm thinking about it as gesture, I'm thinking about it as encounter, then I arrive at the site, which I did, and when I arrive at the site, I am part of the artwork in making a response to the gesture. I am hailed, if I think about it as hail, and I'm pretty convinced by the idea with people like W.J.T. Mitchell, what do images want, about the idea of images hailing, about the idea of responsibility. And it might be linked to the question of appearance that Mi-Won Kwan brought up, that an artwork makes a gesture and opens it for a potentiality for a future response. The artwork is thus off of itself, as I said earlier. It's off of itself into the opened interval of a potential space for response, right? So what is that interval? Now, we could say that that's a betweenness. That's what Michael Fried says, and he calls it theatricality. But I think that theatricality is perhaps one way to think about it, but maybe a limited way to think about what and how betweenness can mean. That the interval of a gesture, and there's such amazing work on gesture from Marcel Mauss to a lot of dance scholarship on gesture that can inform us here. But I think one of the interesting things about gesture is it always assumes a futurity because it is unfixed. A gesture opens for, if you say with Evita Ronal, she says a gesture like greeting always establishes relation. So it's unclear what that relation is going to be when it's gesture. That is determined by response. This is like what the Duchamp quote that we had earlier, that, well, my artwork is going to exist relative to the conversations that are had about it. And then one has to say, well, are those conversations actually part of the artwork? Or, so that interval between the artwork and its conversations is, in a sense, the artwork off of itself and into its surround. Now, to think about this as call and response is to also think about it like Tommy DeFrance and Anita Gonzalez really talk about call and response as Black aesthetic experience, and is to begin to sort of go into. And in the longer version of this piece, I do this impossible thing. This is what gestures are ongoing body-jumping performances that have the potential to carry history in different directions with each eruptive singularity. So where I go in the broader piece is to try to think of the absolutely incommensurable, and I'm sorry that I didn't have time to do it with folks that are trying to think about Blackness and being, like Christina Sharp, whose such phrases like "in the wake of the past that is not past reappears," is to go with some Black radical thought to sort of think about not the past and the future in a linear time in which that which is past is lost, if not preserved, but about the eruptive past in a moment for a potential kind of cross-temporal engagement in which that past is going to re-erupt, is going to ask for account, and will have will have a response, like from you. You will have to give account, or you will be asked to give account. So I think where I go is the absolutely incommensurable place after the hands in the cave to try to think about Black Lives Matter and the hands up, don't shoot. Gestures, in part, these are absolutely incommensurable, and 40,000 years is an absolutely impossible interval with absolutely so I don't make any claims about the Paleolithic hands being protest gestures or the hands up, don't shoot kind of actions being primordial or essential in any way. But I'm trying to think about responsibilities toward and otherwise. For the question of gesture that opens up potentials for a possibility, puts off of the artwork or the gesture a site for thinking of other modes of time than those that give us only forward movement in a model of progress that has also brought us the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Emily Keldy. Emily Keldy is director of the Felix Gonzalez Torres Foundation. Founded in 2002, the Felix Gonzalez Torres Foundation focuses its activities on creating resources and supporting projects that preserve openness and demonstrate the potential for change to continually unfold around the work of Gonzalez Torres over time. Keldy holds an MA in Arts Administration from Columbia University, where she studied arts law and the varied roles of artist-endowed foundations. Please join me in welcoming Emily.
Of course, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. And I'm genuinely excited to talk about Felix's work, especially in the context of this discussion. And I'm realizing after the panels this morning and early afternoon that I would need hours and potentially days to share everything that could be relevant here. But I will do my best to stick to the slides. So yes, the foundation serves as a resource on the work of Gonzalez Torres and provides support for and creates records of each context in which the work is included, whether that be exhibitions, publications, and really scholarship at all levels. And what I'm going to do today is share some of the information from our records to give you a sense of basically the type of information that we keep, the scope of that information, and how it's informed by the nature of the work itself. Nice. So with Felix's work, there's embedded strategies in the work that implicate the owner, the exhibitor, the visitor, and that allow for the work to remain open to new interpretations and respond to changing circumstances. The foundation maintains thorough records that describe decisions and scenarios that have played out around the work over time, and the types of change that have both taken place and also serve as a signal to the types of changes that can continue to take place over time. And when we talk about Gonzalez Torres' work, there are several bodies of work that can come into and out of physical existence, that can exist in more than one place at a time, and don't necessarily need to physically exist in order to continue to exist. And these works, we've talked a lot about this word today, we refer to them as the manifestable works. That body of work includes the candy works, like the work pictured here, entitled USA Today, the paper stack works with Miwan mentioned earlier, the beaded curtains, the text portraits, and the billboard works. With each of these manifestable works, there are specific yet open-ended parameters that are negotiated at the point of each exhibition. So to give you an example with the candy works, each time that this work is shown, the exact type of candy used for that exhibition is chosen, the configuration is chosen, and then you also have these durative decisions that you make over the course of the exhibition about replenishment. So for instance, this is that same work, entitled USA Today, shown in Brussels 20 years later. So the work is still piled against a wall, but it's no longer in a corner. The candies that were sourced from that 1990 show happen to be from a place in Chicago called Peerless. These were sourced in Europe. And here's an installation image of that same work installed by the same curator in the context of the same exhibition, but at a different venue, where she's chosen a long rectangular carpet shape. So you have the same individual engaging with these parameters in a very similar circumstance with a totally different outcome. Now, also in the manifestable works are the text portrait works. These works consist of a line or line of text that are installed just below the point where the wall meets the ceiling at frieze height. And with each manifestation of these works, the owner can actually choose to add or take away text from the piece itself. So to give you an idea of how that change happens, these are all the iterations of the work that we just saw, all the text iterations that the artist used to install the work in his lifetime. So you see that content shifts, dates change, it both expands and contracts. But there's a real potential for change. And this is one of the types of records that we keep at the foundation, where each iteration is kept kind of on even ground, and they're all considered as the work is manifested over time. Now, I mentioned the owner a moment ago, and it's important to clarify with Felix's work, and especially as we were talking about earlier, is that the owner has a really integral role in the work, basically. They're really more a steward than a property owner, and each time that the work is exhibited, it's actually the owner that's deciding to approve that exhibition, whether it's, of course, being exhibited privately in someone's home or as part of a permanent collection show for an institution, or in the case of loans by an authorized borrower. Now, when the work is loaned, the owner is actually compelled to loan certain rights to make decisions around the work. So you have this additional strategy that is layered into the work, where it's not only that single owner who's making decisions, but then these borrowers as well, these other individuals. So this is the first commissioned text portrait work. This is Untitled Portrait of the Wongs, 1991. And the content of the text was originally kind of arrived at by Felix coming to the owner and saying, provide me with a list of events and their dates that you feel define who you are as a person. And in this case, who the family was, the Wong family. And so they did, they came back. And for the most part, most of the events were personal or private in nature. And what the artist then did was interjected within that more events of historical significance and corresponding dates. And that really speaks to a theme that you can find throughout Felix's work, where the public and private selves are very much enmeshed. So I want to look closer at a couple instances in this specific portrait work to show the way that contradictions basically exist in Felix's work. So if we look at this close-up, you see that the Flinstones, you may or may not notice this, but is spelled in an interesting way. The way that these works are installed is that the medium is mentioned is listed as paint on wall. There's been other mediums that have been used over time, but in this case, it was hand painted by a sign painter. And in talking with the owner, we found out that it was just a simple, mistake of human error, which is why the misspelling was there. But it's been installed in their home since 1991, and they haven't changed it. We also have one other discrepancy in this portrait when you look closely, which is silver anniversary. The Wong family had submitted the engagement, 1966, as one of the events that defined them. And it seems that Felix may have concluded then that the silver anniversary fell 25 years later in 1991, the date of the work. In reality, their silver anniversary was actually 1992. So the reason why I bring both of these up is because the owner of this particular portrait has only lent it on a few occasions, but has decided to make decisions around these very small kind of instances or subtle aspects of the portrait. So the first time that this work was exhibited publicly was at the Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, Ireland in 2015. And so what the owner chose to do here was correct for the silver anniversary. So the year 1992 was shown, but they actually retained that Flinstones typo. They've decided that that holds meaning for them. that it's a part of their place in the work. And so in this installation of the work, Flinstones was spelled incorrectly. And here is another install shot of that. Now, the following year, the work was shown at Andrea Rosen Gallery in New York, a solo exhibition that was curated by Julie Alt and Ronnie Horn. And in this case, the Wongs decided again that they were going to determine the text of the portrait, and they would like to retain the to preserve that typo and correct the year. But the curators, Julie and Ronnie, pushed back to actually have Flintstones corrected, and the owner responded to it. And if you look to the right of center, you see the Flintstones spelled correctly, 1966. That was the last year that it aired on ABC. So here are the 3 iterations of this text portrait that have existed over time. And whereas the changes are really subtle, and you might you may miss them in looking at the record, we have a responsibility in the foundation to record as much information as we can about what informed those changes, what kind of circumstances brought them about, so that you can better understand, so that one kind of looking at the work can better understand the nuance of the work and where decisions can be made. Okay, the next context that I'm going to talk about is a solo exhibition, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Specific Objects Without Specific Form, that was a 3-venue solo exhibition that was organized, and kind of the overarching curator was Elena Filipovich. She conceived the curatorial concept where in each of the venues, she would curate what you might think of as a traditional retrospective of Felix's work, and a midpoint through the exhibition, a visual artist would come in and completely reconsider what that would mean. They weren't limited by any decisions that Elena made. They weren't limited by the checklist that she had. So it's a structure that really shows the type of change that can unfold around the work over time. Now, Tino curated the final installation of the final venue of the show, and his version of the installation was to have 6 installations that played out over the course of each day. So I'm going to walk you through a couple installation images of one room of that exhibition that has a work with a fixed installation to serve as a kind of baseline, so you can get a sense of how that shifted over the course of each day. So here's the work Untitled Orpheus Twice. It's paired mirrors that are installed into the wall, so it's actually flush with the wall. And then in front of that is the work Untitled 1989-1990, which is a paired stack work. To give you another sense of kind of the breadth of decision-making that can happen around these works, the ideal height of this work that's listed in the caption is 26 inches, which it clearly is not here. It was about 5 or 6 inches when it was installed. And this speaks to the fact that these decisions can be made at the point of exhibition. And in speaking with the curator, part of the reason for doing that was because the works were moving from room to room. So they needed to be more portable. So if we look to the next iteration of the show, there's another mirror work in that room. And both of these works could be considered manifestable because they can exist in more than one place at a time, because you source the materials needed to exhibit them at the point of exhibition. But with these, the dimensions are specific, and you follow them, and they're simply installed. There's less negotiation at that point. So this is how that room looked for 2 of the iterations of the installation. And then a light string work, Untitled Silver, was hung over the mirrors. And the light string works kind of occupy this interesting in-between space with Felix's work, because there are certain aspects of them that are malleable. The way that they're installed, that light string could be hung from the ceiling or completely on the floor or just hung along the wall. These are all decisions that are made by the exhibitor. The light bulbs could be on or off, and the light bulbs that are used to install the work can be sourced at the point of exhibition as well. So there's all this kind of change that's happening that you may not be aware of as a visitor. And then in the second to last installation, he paired this work simply with what we call in Felix's practice a static work, something that doesn't change. This is a framed acetate piece called Untitled Just Say No. And in the final iteration of the work, you have Untitled, a corner of bocce, as several handfuls of candy that are just installed in front of the mirrors. And this is the piece that Mion also mentioned earlier, having an issue with pests. But the ideal weight for that work is actually 42 pounds. And here we have just a few candies, which may have at any point in that exhibition disappeared completely towards the end of the day. And what's kind of important to show with this exhibition context is that the way in which these works moved around the space is that the art handlers were in there shifting the works around the visitors. So they conceived of these contraptions to move stacks around while maintaining clean edges. And you may have been in a room, these are all visitors, alongside an art handler who was stringing a light string up to the ceiling. This also gives you an idea of the different ways in which those works can be installed. And this also really speaks to, this exhibition format really speaks to the agency of the visitor, because depending upon when they were there during the day, how long they stayed, how they navigated the space, really dictated what version of the exhibition was theirs. And there's one work that really shows that well. This is Untitled Perfect Lovers, 1987 to 1990. That's the paired clocks that's installed low on the wall there. This is another work where there is an ideal height that is mentioned in the records of being above head height, around 8.5 feet, where a wall clock would typically exist. But Tino, again, took liberties with this. There was nothing saying that no matter what, the clocks couldn't be installed lower on the wall, and so he did. So depending upon when that visitor may have been there during the day, you either saw them installed there, you may have seen them being installed in a different room, as part of a complete installation, which in the context of Tino's kind of curatorial project almost felt like a moment of rest, as kind of the background of something that was actually happening for another work that was leaving the space. Or it may have been simply in the staging area, basically off view, laying dormant, along with backup candies for different works and different static works. And something, again, to go back to that Duchamp quote from earlier about the life of the work being contingent upon its relevance, you can really think about the materiality of Felix's work and its potential to continue to change as being informed by and helped by the fact that there's no one specific meaning that these works are intended to carry. So they can continue to be relevant in any context. And that continued relevance will ensure their continued exhibition, which will ensure this continued change. So even though that contextual aspect may be a sidebar, it seems quite related, actually. So the last project that I'm going to talk to you about is something that we've written a case study for in the foundation. I was just talking with someone else as one of the issues that you have when creating really thorough records is that they become so unwieldy that they're almost inaccessible. And with Felix's work, we don't want to create a situation where it seems as though you must have these complete records in order to manifest the work. We wouldn't want to encumber the work in that way. So we also make this, we have this type of record keeping that we just call case studies, which are very succinct, brief summaries of situations that have just played out around the work, because that can actually be handed off to exhibitors, to scholars, to researchers, and they can actually digest that content and really act from it. I'm seeing them nodding because you do these oral archive interviews and you end up with 30 pages of content for one interview. And the dedication it takes to actually access that is not something that people will have the time, energy, or efforts to do necessarily. So with this work, Untitled Loverboys, 1991, installed at the ICA in Boston. This is a work where the candies that are used to manifest the work are very specific. These are these blue and white swirled mint candies that were originally manufactured by a candy manufacturer in Belgium called Cathy Confiserie. That candy manufacturer is still in business, and so more often than not, people will just kind of revert back to making the decision of using that candy to manifest the work, which is what they did here. So they installed the work. People came to the work, people chose to take from the work, and part of their decision-making around replenishment was to check at a midpoint through the exhibition and decide how much they needed to reorder in order to replenish the candy. This is kind of just a funny circumstance, but when they went to reorder, the machine at Cathy Confiserie had failed. They couldn't complete the order. So then the institution is in a situation where they have to reconsider the decisions that they made previously, and they're on a really, really tight time frame. So what they decided to do here was let the work deplete completely. That iteration of the work deplete completely. So that candy that was used completely vanished. And I do believe that it existed for a while as an empty space. And what they were able to find was there's a northeastern candy supplier called Hilltop Saltwater Taffy that could mimic that blue and white swirl, but it's not in a clear cellophane wrapper. It's in a wax paper wrapper. And the candy isn't hard candy. It's chewy taffy. But for them, the most important thing was finding a way to preserve that aesthetic of the candy. So this is the choice that they made. This is one of the types of records the foundation keeps, is that any time that one of these works is manifested, any time that these manifestable works, are manifested, whether they be paper stacks, candies, beaded curtains, etc., we request that manifestation samples be sent back to us so that they can be considered and also illustrate, the type of change that can happen around material choice. So they were installed as the work, and you can see that then you have an artwork in the same space that looks quite different than it did before. And now it's lived its kind of own life in the context of that exhibition. And whereas some artworks may have been, if this situation had played around certain artworks, it may have been that it couldn't have been exhibited for the run of the show. The open-ended parameters of Felix's work actually allow for this dynamic decision-making to continue to take place. And so it actually ends up being proof positive of its resiliency. So I think I will end on that.
Okay, and our final presentation for today before the Q&A is Adrienne Edwards. Adrienne Edwards joined the Whitney Museum of American Art as Engel Speyer Family Curator and Curator of Performance in 2018. Prior to her appointment, Edwards curated performance commissions for the New York-based biennial Performa since 2010, including last year's Afroglossia, which focused on cross-boundary art by African artists and featured new works by Ito Barada, Teju Cole, Kwani Trust, Julie Moretu, Jason Moran, Wagenshi Mutu, and Tracy Rose. Edwards additionally served as curator at large at the Walker Center in Minneapolis since 2016, for which she organized a survey of work by the jazz pianist Jason Moran that will travel to the Institute for Contemporary Art Boston and Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. At the Walker, Edwards also co-led a $1 million Mellon Foundation interdisciplinary initiative, which supported multidisciplinary projects. Edwards has independently curated exhibitions at galleries, most notably Blackness and Abstraction, an expansive survey of the color Black and non-figurative work for New York's Pace Gallery in 2016. She has also contributed to Art in America, Aperture, and Parquet, among many other publications. This May, she curated a project by Kapwani Kiwanga, who was named winner of this year's Frieze Artist Award, and a live program of installations and time-based work at the Frieze New York Art Fair. Please join me in welcoming Adrienne. There's just too much to go into, but I thought I would do my moderating duties and maybe open up a question for us and then turn it to the floor. One thing that really strikes me between all of your presentations is that this notion of the archive is not only a repository, right, of materials or memories or conditions that contain a historical object, but we're presented in all three presentations with this notion of the archive a living one, a breathing one, one that anticipates history, right? One that always has a kind of future in mind. I think, Rebecca, you talked about it in relation to gesture. Emily, your work is about this notion of the manifestable, right? And Adrian, all I can see is the sensorial in here, right? And so I'm wondering how all three of you might, if you could reflect a little bit about those things that are intangible, right? And how they may, the affective, the sensorial, the fleshly, the endurable, how they make themselves appear or not appear in how you conduct the questions around archival sensibilities or archival research or archival practice.
I'll start. Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about appearing or not appearing that I wanted to get to with, this sort of outrageous thing of talking about the negative hand in the context of contemporary work is, the striking notion, the sensation when you're there that there is both appearance and disappearance simultaneously. So again, this isn't a binary. So if it's an event, then this absent person, it's an encounter in which the absent artist, hand printer, whatever you want to call the Paleolithic woman in the case of where this really struck me, is both not there and there. And I, as the future person, am also not there and there. In other words, if it was cast already into a future, then that future was part of the intention, I guess, if you want to use that word, which is really not necessarily a word I would want to use, but it's already contained in the piece. And so disappearance and appearance are simultaneous in the event. Which I think complicates maybe some of the question earlier that Miwan was bringing up about appearance and disappearance in more in syncopated time, or maybe syncopated time is a way of thinking about that. But I think that the archive traditionally sort of structures appearance and disappearance to be binary oppositions rather than simultaneous or syncopated constructs.
Well, it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the types of questions that we ask exhibitors and owners, et cetera. Not only about the way that they've manifest the work, actual instances in which the work has appeared, but we ask them these questions that are almost more durative around the work. As, for example, what decisions are you making around the work right now that you couldn't have made 20 years ago? What decisions, so as to both have this record of what they've done, and also this idea, I guess, or something a little bit less tangible about what informed that and what is, how possibilities have kind of played out. So instead of just asking straightforward questions, we end up asking these more open-ended questions as well. Even what exhibitions have you seen that have changed the way you think about the work or the potential of the work? So we try and get beyond just the discrete appearances of the work to what they think the potential could be, even though it's yet to be realized. Maybe that's
I'm not really sure, I guess, how to respond to that. Maybe because I'm a bit sensual or sensorial or something, but I think it's an interesting read because there is something that I think about coming into a museum setting, right, and being charged with doing the kind of work that I've been charged with doing, is how to both hold that position, something I'm very, very clear about what that requires, but also because my mode of working has been so deeply artistic, actually, kind of in tandem, we were talking over lunch about this notion of like what it means to be a curator-producer, right? When you're commissioning work, when you're in the trenches with artists from their conceptualization of an idea to its full realization. And the needs of what it means to be a museum, because museums function to convey value, right? I mean, that's really what happens here. That's why that question about the market earlier was kind of interesting, right? Because it has direct correlation and implications. I need to be able to get these artists and those works into a position where they are museum ready, right? And I have some real understanding around what that means for the institution's benefit, but also for the benefit of the work itself. In other words, we're at this critical moment where there is a real institutionalization process taking place vis-a-vis interdisciplinary art or performance. For me, it becomes a container to talk about all these different modes of working, conceptual, abstract, whatever that we've been talking, installation that we've been talking about today, the unruly ones, right? So there's a way in which there has to be the fashioning of a process in partnership with artists and in partnership with colleagues in the institution that actually enables something to transition into that institution, right? That's what I mean by commissioning for the purpose of acquisition. So it's not only just records, it's actually material, it's actually, because many artists making performance today, it's not just the body, right? Whatever that, the living body, right? They are literally containing containers of experience. So what does it mean to, even the way in which approaches to performance has become much more sophisticated, what does that mean? You know, artists are already getting themselves to be museum ready. So how do you become a facilitator and someone who can foster those dreams?
I think we have some time for questions from the floor. Oh, yeah.
Question for Adrian about the museum ready, helping the artist. It's such a interesting formulation. The works that you showed, especially the last two, I'm wondering about the way that established art historical figures, references, projects are integrated into the works as a kind of perhaps call and response that actually Rebecca was describing more theoretically. Whether that aspect is part of the museum-ready quality of the works.
I would say not, because in both instances with those works, which is why I selected them, is that they were not done for a museum context at all, right? Like when I commissioned Adam and Yvonne to work together on that piece was for Performa, right? And it wasn't even in the context of the biennial, actually. I said to them, I want to do something outside of the confines of the month, the 3 weeks of the biennial. Are you game? So it was done intentionally outside of any construct, right? But there is something to the quality, I think, that I talk to Adam a lot about, the production quality of the work, right? And our expectations of it. And then I have questions around what does the documentation of Trio A do inside that work? Like, what is that affect? Is that, problematic? At that moment, Trio A, Yvonne, what I described as transgressive, if you don't know, is that Yvonne had done this no manifesto, right? No music, no blah, 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 blah. And then he layers on this gospel song, right? Which he did not discuss with her, right? So we had this whole conversation around license with history, even when you're directly involved, inserting oneself into a particular art historical canon. Like, what kind of licenses can you take because you're already outside of it, right? There's not the same reverence for a certain kind of material or attention to needing to protect certain legacies. And Yvonne was totally game for it, right? She knew exactly that all of this would become undone. And then she and I had a whole conversation around her history with privilege, right, in making that film, how women of color felt about it, how her turn from experimental dance making in the late 60s, early 70s into filmmaking, so there's a lot sitting in terms of personal and aesthetic history in that video that doesn't get explicated necessarily. And Ralph first did this kind of Nauman exploration, which is really a tribute. The piece, which has a neon attached to it, black neon that says "Fuck Bruce Nauman," and the video they're kind of partners, right? They're counterpoints to one another. He has incredible reverence for Nauman. That "Fuck Bruce Nauman" is really a kind of jealousy about the freedom, about questions of freedom and individual agency that Nauman could take in the 60s, that Ralph, who was clearly was very young at that time, but thinking about art, beginning to initiate his career, couldn't take, right? So there becomes this like dance around even the notion of possibility sitting there. But Ralph made that, so it was in 2002 that he did a live performance at the Walker, actually. And then a couple years later did this study, right? Those books that he's tossing around on the chair are actually from a library that had been flooded during Hurricane Katrina in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. So it's all about like the fact that all of this time and art, these things are so sullied, they're not pristine, they're not clean, in every way that people think about a figure like Nauman, right? It's thicker, it's denser, particularly in relationship to the others. But that my showing that in the Walker context, and we could argue if the Walker is a museum or not, was the first time it was shown in a museological context, right? It had been shown once before at the Kitchen in New York, but nowhere else.
Do we have any other questions, comments? That's shocking. Do you all have questions for each other?
I have a question for everybody, or maybe about instruction. That's something that's been really usefully circulating around here today, which was that the instruction is not the art itself, and but the instruction exists in some relationship to the art itself. And I think there's a lot that can be said. Obviously, my background is theater. Most obviously, it's not art history. But the question of the play script and the manifestation of the play seems very differently oriented. In other words, when a play is, quote, manifested, it's not considered that it's not the play. The play is a set of instructions, but it's also manifested in the piece. So the instructions can be both the piece, right, and something prior to or scripting a futurity for. In other words, it's a deferred time off of the object itself, but it doesn't sort of disappear. So in thinking about the Paleolithic hand as a gesture, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of its ongoingness, in terms of it meeting, even after a long period of time where it's invisible, where no one is there. And many of these are placed where it's difficult to see, so visibility isn't necessarily part of the picture. But one of my questions would be, isn't that a kind of instruction? It is in a sense a hail, or obviously a wave is an everyday gesture, and it's not given that this wave, that we know what this means, hello, stop, goodbye, go away, come here, any of those things. But it might be seen as a kind of instruction. I mean, is there any, if anyone, and you won't have to answer it now, but maybe later if you want to come up to me and tell me, what would be the distinction between something like gesture and the beckoning, the invitation for future relation? What would be the difference between gesture and its suggestion of an embodiedness to something like instruction, which also is off of itself into a future of a potential manifestation? So I'm interested in that question, if anyone wants to talk with me about it later, if not now.
Well, I can talk to you about it now.
Okay.
With Felix's work, the instructions for the work exist in the certificate of authenticity, right? Like what Miwan showed earlier, where you have instructions in that an original manifestation or an initial installation or an original material used is very dutifully described. For instance, a type of candy would be described along with the manufacturer, where it was purchased from, the flavor of the candy, all of that information as instruction. And then that paragraph ends with a similar candy may be used, which feels very much like gesture. And that, we kind of deal with those conversations a lot in the foundation. What is the work? Is it the physical instance? Is it the certificate itself? Is it maybe that last line, a similar candy may be used, that points to everything that can unfold around the work over time? But as it relates to Felix's work, that exists across all of those bodies of work.
There's a question in the audience.
Oh, great. I think this will be our final one because Jill's giving me eyes.
Thank you. I just have a question for Adrian and Emily. A lot of what we're talking about has to do with license and the limits of license. I wonder if maybe, Emily, have there been occasions where you have had to say no to someone's proposal, or if there has been conflict? And Adrian, in working with artists and shepherding their enthusiasm, have you had to manage maybe conflict between one artist's vision and another artist's vision in terms of appropriating or engaging with each other's work?
Well, as far as saying no, it's really the responsibility of an owner of an artwork to decide whether that will be included in whatever context it's included in. But as far as maybe steering someone in a certain direction, I would say that what we kind of run up against more than anything else is that tendency to want to go back to the original, really desperately replicate that as closely as possible. And that is something that we bump up against. That is something that we try and provide as much information as we can so that it becomes clear that actually it's a part of the work to acknowledge that original and then reconsider and move on and evolve. And at any point you can go back to it, but you're not bound by it. So I would say that ends up being the conversation that most often we have to kind of steer in a different direction when there's too close of an adherence to original materials or processes.
Oh yes, Pavel, there are tales, and you know there are tales. Yes, but part of the job is one of negotiation and mediation. That's with anything really. So indeed, but I think because we're short on time, I'll just stop there.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Adrian, that was such a diplomatic way to end. Thank you, everyone, and especially thanks to our fantastic speakers and to all of you for the questions that you've generated and the conversations that you've fueled here today. I have just a couple logistical things to note. If all of our speakers who are here can come touch base with me super quick at the podium as soon as we kind of break, then I'd be grateful for that. Our next talk is our evening keynote, which is in the museum's Fullerton Hall in the older part of the building. The museum is open late tonight, so everyone can migrate by moving through the museum and moving your way over to Fullerton Hall. There should be some signs, and follow the staff members who know their way. For those of you who are staying for the workshop tomorrow, please bring your folders and your name tags as well, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And so now we're running a little bit short on time because Naeem's talk begins at 6. So I'm going to wrap this up. Final applause for everyone. Thank you so much.